This video is brought to you in association with the family book of Word of the Day, For a Year, Every Year, Forever, a book by Johnny Pierce, myself, and a book designed to expand your vocabulary so that you sound awesome with lots of very big words. An interesting book with some irreverent commentary or etymological, the word history of the words, or interesting facts about the words. Anyway, it's a cracking book. Please go to a reputable bookseller and order yourself a copy. Hi there, and welcome to another Tippling Philosopher video. Today I'm going to talk about cancel culture because I was on the Unbelievable podcast radio show with Justin Briley last night in debate with David French, an American attorney and never Trumper Republican or former Republican, so a conservative, evangelical Christian. And we were discussing cancel culture, and there was so much that I wanted to talk about, so much content, that an hour's show with three people trying to vie for talk time meant that I just couldn't even remotely get my points across. It was great, loved it, lovely conversation, but there's so much more to say, so I thought I'd put it together in a video. The main thrust of the video is this, that cancel culture does exist, and it does affect people on the left and right, and in the middle. When it happens on the left, it is a case of the left eating itself, when the left needs to be unified if it wants to compete successfully and effectively against the right. But that the whole idea of cancel culture and the claims made, particularly by the right, are massively overblown. And they are overblown because this is how it is used to be a part of the right's culture wars narrative. But I'll talk about that in much greater depth later. But at the beginning here, I am not saying that it never happens. There are people who are genuinely cancelled. There are people who are attacked online by mobs on Twitter. And it's not great when that happens. And when threats are made, that's not great. But part of the problem comes from really defining what cancel culture is. So an official sort of definition might be something like this that you could find on dictionary.com, which is: cancel culture refers to the popular practice of withdrawing support for cancelling public figures and companies after they have done or said something considered objectionable or offensive. Cancel culture is generally discussed as being performed on social media in the form of group shaming. Now, the problem here is that there's a difference between online threats or online calls for people to be cancelled and people actually being cancelled. And it seems often that the whole thing is defined as cancel culture, like the culture of people shouting for other people to be cancelled. And I think that's problematic because in reality, there really aren't that many people who are actually cancelled. And so therefore, it refers more often than not to a bunch of bluster rather than the actual act of cancelling someone. And I think that needs a little bit of unpicking. And sometimes you get definitions that actually preclude the right from even being included in cancel culture. So I was watching a news segment on YouTube the other day, and the newscaster actually said cancel culture was defined as no longer accepted among woke society, which is to say that you can only be cancelled if you're thrown out of woke society, which means it's a problem of the left automatically, by definition. And that's hugely problematic. So what I want to set out today is, I'll talk a little bit about cancel culture as a definition, and there are broadly 8 points I want to make. And these are the 8 points. How much is this really happening? So what is the data to show that we're in the grips of some cancel culture scenario in society that is shaking society to its foundations? It's this big thing that we really need to worry about. What's the data to suggest there's a trend towards that? And what's the data to suggest that there are a huge amounts of real life cases of cancelling taking place? The second point, point 2, is it looks to be part of the culture wars narrative. So the right is blowing these incidents of cancel culture out of all proportion, or claiming things that aren't cancel culture to be cancel culture, in order to divert away from conversations that are far more warranted. And this leads into sort of campaigning for the right to win over the centre and to poison the well of the left. Point 3 is that it happens on the right as much as it does on the left. And it often just isn't labelled as cancel culture. Point 4 is that there is hypocrisy often with people who are claiming cancel culture, that they are attempting to cancel others themselves, which is problematic. Point 5 is that there are many examples, particularly claimed to the right, that aren't actually really cancel culture, but they're thrown in to be supposed examples of cancel culture to make it sound that it's far worse than it really is. Point 6 is that there is a debate as to whether this really is a freedom of speech issue, because actually many people who are supposedly cancelled have no problem sounding off their message, and after they're supposedly being cancelled actually have a far greater platform to sound off their message than they did previously. So it's almost like instead of being deplatformed, they are up-platformed. Point 7 is again on freedom of speech, and freedom of speech is pretty much a broken concept to a large degree. But the people who are on Twitter, these Twitter mobs, or whoever it is that is claiming that someone should be cancelled, are themselves exercising their right to freedom of speech. And how does that play? You can't on the one hand say, I'm having my freedom of speech curtailed. They shouldn't be able to do and say that, when they're saying that is indeed the same freedom of speech that they are entitled to. And the final point, point 8, is chronocentrism, which is to say that the thinking that this is a problem of the here and now is actually incorrect. This has always been happening. We have always been moral fundamentalists that like to throw around our moralising. What has largely changed is the platform of social media. So those are my 8 points. And within that, we have issues of this being an authoritarian problem, arguably, of the left, the far left and the far right. Moral authoritarianism. And as I say, it happens across that spectrum of political thought. And we might touch a little bit on how to solve this, but arguably it may not be particularly easily soluble. So there you go. Right, so let's have a little look at definitions, or I've given you a definition, which I'm fine with, the dictionary.com definition. I'm going to give you an analogy now, which is written by Mark Fisher in an essay called The Vampire's Castle. And he was actually quite critical of this being a problem for the left, especially when you want to unify the left. And this was talked about a lot by Michael Brooks, the late great Michael Brooks, in Against the Web, and people like Anna Kasparian, who are big figures on the left, progressive left, who say this is a problem for the left. And it is a case of the left eating itself, and we really need to stop this, because if we want to be successful, we need to unify. Of course, the problem with the left is it's like herding cats, and the unification on the left is quite difficult because everyone likes to have a go at each other, where the right is far better at campaigning and unifying behind what is often problematic figureheads, but they don't have a problem with that because they can set aside their differences to unify. Anyway, and although I agree with Michael Brooks and Anna Kasparian to a degree, when it happens, genuinely happens on the left, it is a problem. I just don't think it happens as much as people claim it does. But I love this analogy. Driven by so he says the vampire's castle, i.e. this kind of idea of cancel culture, is driven by a priest's desire to excommunicate and condemn, an academic pedant's desire to be the first to spot the mistake, and a hipster's desire to be the one of the in crowd. And that's three interesting examples of a priest, an academic pedant, and a hipster that kind of cover that political spectrum. That's why I like that analogy, and I think it works fairly well. One of the things about cancel culture is that many people who claim it's kind of largely mythological is that when people say things in the public sphere, they should be held accountable for what they say. And all this is a case of public accountability for things that have been said and done. But where it becomes problematic is the mob mentality of places like Twitter, and I do understand that. But let's go to my 8 points. And a lot of this came about after Harper's letter, the letter in Harper's that was signed by a whole bunch of signatories, and the letter itself was absolutely fine. It was just, it is what everyone, left or right, would expect. Good and fair debate should be able to be, but it was just a bit nebulous and kind of asking for this kind of generic state of affairs and saying, it talks about swift and severe retribution. Well, what is swift and severe retribution? And has that actually really happened? People shouting for it and saying horrible things on Twitter isn't actually swift and severe retribution, although it may be calling for that. But again, it's the difference between calling for something and something actually happening. And many of those on signatories of the letter have exceptional wealth and platform. And although some of those people had been attempted to be cancelled in the past or had attacks on, Noam Chomsky very famously in the limelight for things like that, they have and still enjoy wonderful platform. So there is this tension between kind of real, actual deplatforming and cancellation and the people signing that letter. I don't know. Anyway, going to my 8 points. The first point is data, okay? So when people like David French, with whom I debated last night, say America is in the grips of a fundamentalist revival, but it's not Christian, that was the title of his article. Actually, is America in the grips of this? Is it happening as much as you think? And often people resort to sourcing the Heterodox Academy, who wrote a piece, Sean Stevens wrote a piece in 2018, The Skeptics Are Wrong, Part 2, Speech Culture on Campus is Changing, which laid out a whole bunch of data suggesting that actually there is a trend towards the left wing being perpetuating this cancel culture scenario and a prevalence amongst the left for cancellation. But two psychologists from the Heterodox Academy themselves, on a podcast called Two Psychologists and Four Beers, Joel Limbaugh and Michael Inslicht, actually produced a really good podcast that looked at their own data, or not their own, the data claimed by another writer at Heterodox Academy, and basically said, well, actually the data isn't really good enough and you can't really derive many sound conclusions. And actually some of the data is quite interesting and nuanced. So in 2013 and 14 and 15, there was an increase in support for controversial topics on campuses. So actually people were becoming more controversial without a problem. And in 2016, this drops. So the question is, well, what happened in 2016? Trump was elected. Okay, so maybe people are reacting against Trump being elected by saying, okay, we can't let hideous things be said in public like we're hearing Trump saying. So in 2016, people then started having more of an issue with controversial topics being talked about and certain things being criticised. But what this arguably looks like is an anomaly. So 2016, there's just not enough data, but even with that data, it looks like 2016 is an anomaly, just a 1 year uptick. And really, it's not enough to say that this is a massive trend and there is happening hugely in number across the campuses in America. And actually, when you then start looking at some other data, so data for 18 to 24-year-olds, they were more in favour of making laws to make it illegal to say offensive or insulting things. So you think, people want to shut down freedom of speech. This is a problem, but this is a problem of the left. And although there's a little bit more in favour of shutting down criticism of immigrants and your classic liberal subjects, actually, there was an uptick in people wanting to make it illegal to say insulting things about white people and service people in the military. So these are classic right-wing subjects that if you were the left were criticising these things, then obviously it must be people on the right wanting to shut down freedom of speech. And actually, these statistics aren't massively in support of this being a rising problem for the left, but actually it cuts both ways. So, I mean, the takeaway point is the data is just not good enough to be able to support this. There are some elements where you think actually there is a bit of a trend going on possibly in this kind of area, or these questions have shown something to think about. But in general, the data is just not good enough. There's just not a good enough data set. It's too small. The disinvitation database that is what it's called it's just not got enough data. So I think that's something that still needs to be established. So my first point, statistically, if you're going to make a claim about this being a massive problem, particularly for the left, you need to show me the data for that, okay, to support your argument. Otherwise, it's just a mere assertion and you're going on what it feels like because the media are talking about it an awful lot. So yes, it feels like this is a problem for the left because we're constantly told it's a problem for the left by the right and even by some people on the left who might be being persuaded by the media outrage, the moral panic. I mean, to me, this is a classic moral panic. So the second point, this leads me on to the culture wars, and this is arguably going to be my biggest point. So Republicans win elections not because they have more voters, because they don't. So we know that there are more Democratic voters registered and more Democratic leaning people in the electorate in America than Republican. The problem is that they don't always get out and vote, right? So what happens is Republicans are far more motivated to vote and mobilized to vote by the campaigns that take place. Because the Republicans win their campaigns, when they win, by going for the hearts and minds. But this is smokes and mirrors. So you're diverting people by saying, look at this, look, it's like a magician. Look at this. Cancel culture over there, cancel culture, abortion, gun rights, culture wars. Look at this. You can't say Merry Christmas. Starbucks have got things on their coffee cups that say Happy Holidays, not Merry Christmas. And meanwhile, down here, right, all the way over here, look at this. Over here, they're closing down Planned Parenthood and changing this bill, and you've got the 2% of the elites oligarchies running things to the detriment of 98% of the population, and blah blah blah, and universal healthcare, which should be right on the map at the moment given the pandemic. Culture wars. You don't have to talk about all this. Culture wars. Cancel culture. Look at the left. Terrible. Look at the left. Vote Republican. Blah blah blah. And we'll kind of sweep the rest of that important stuff under the carpet. Nesrine Malik in her recent book talked about frequency scrambling, where you divert attention away from the actual issues of the cancel culture. So maybe it's a cancel culture to do with transphobia, right? So it becomes about cancel culture, and you forget to actually talk about the issues of transphobia that are taking place. And that she calls, and others have called, frequency scrambling. So these kind of things are really part of the culture war narrative. It's a vested interest, and you've got to follow the money here. And the vested interest, really, what is the narrative that the right are we know the narrative. It's a culture wars narrative, but what are they trying to hide and why? And they don't want people to know about all the funding that's going in place all the dark money that's going into all these really, problematic policies that will benefit the top 2%, but will largely not benefit the working class. Republicans fight universal healthcare and welfare safety nets for the poor and disenfranchised with talk about fear and outrage. And they pull on these visceral, emotive subject matters like the culture wars, like abortion and gun rights, and the Constitution being stripped away from its citizens by a bullying socialist government. But that's just smoke and mirrors. And as I say, a classic example of a moral panic, which is defined as the feeling of fear spread among many people that some evil threatens the well-being of society. It's the process of arousing social concern over an issue, usually the work of moral entrepreneurs and the mass media. Classic. I think it's classic moral panic, and it's perpetuated by the right to the detriment of the left. And the left need to be able to fight this with a solid bit of campaigning. But it's difficult. It's difficult to unpick these constant barrages of cancel culture. News articles are thrown out continually. So I know many people on the left and centre left who will tell me that cancel culture is a problem of the left. Yeah, but where are you getting that information from? And have you looked into each of these cases to see whether they really are cancel culture and whether this really actually is a problem? And when you say it's a problem, is that a problem compared to the fact that 40 million people in America are underinsured and maybe 20 million people are uninsured? That's a problem, and that's a way bigger problem than cancel culture. So it's about aligning priorities and with reality. Okay. So my third point is it happens just as much on the right as it does on the left, but it's not often called cancel culture. Colin Kaepernick was cancelled, right? He was not allowed to play for his team for kneeling during the national anthem and for not singing the national anthem. Well, the Jehovah's Witnesses in the Second World War did this for their reasons, and they weren't cancelled. The right asked for peaceful protest. We don't want people rioting in the streets. Someone does peaceful protest, and they go absolutely nuts. And you had the president and the vice president calling for him never to play again. And for the NFL not to allow this. That is cancel culture, right? Notre Dame, protesting against Obama because of his stance on stem cell therapy and abortion. Trump himself has attempted to cancel. I've got a list of 31 times that he has tried to cancel other people. Most recently, Goodyear, right? People who shouldn't buy Goodyear tires because of some bit of, racial equality training, and he is like the biggest hypocrite here. In the latest, Republican National Convention, he was talking about cancel culture and how it's a terrible problem of the left, and he is the single biggest example of someone who is trying to cancel others. It is unbelievable. So, the list is long. The Daily Mail, who always bang on about cancel culture in Britain, the UK's right-wing answer to Fox News, tried to cancel Ben & Jerry's recently because Ben & Jerry's had the audacity to stand up for the humanity of migrants. Republicans with Dolly Parton, who had the audacity to mention Black Lives Matter, BLM, and Republicans are calling on Dolly Parton to be cancelled. Tom Cotton, Republican for Arkansas, wants to pass a bill defunding schools who are attempting to teach the 1619 Project, looking to reframe history and take into account slavery and black history. He wants to defund the schools, to deplatform the schools so that they can't teach so they basically don't get the funding to be able to operate. And all because they want to teach certain elements of black history. Dixie Chicks back with Bush and the Iraq War cancelled for criticising military intervention in Iraq and the government. Abortion, you can argue, people standing outside abortion clinics, Planned Parenthood clinics, and shouting about this and shouting about that and stopping people from accessing the services within, feeling that they are not safe to do so, and then lobbying and shouting at their politicians to change the laws so that these places are defunded and deplatformed, and in the end there are no services available within a whole state for such a thing. You've got Bill Maher with his show Politically Incorrect when it was on HBO. He said an awful lot of things that the left, you would expect to go absolutely crazy about. Didn't get cancelled for that. What did the show actually get cancelled for? Well, he criticised the military and the government at the time, and the press secretary for the White House took issue with this, and sponsors pulled out because he was criticising the military. So this is cancelled from the right, okay? You've got Starbucks every time Christmas comes along and they put Happy Holidays on their cups. You've got the right wanting to cancel Starbucks. You've got Target who had their thing with genderless toys and with not banning trans people from their toilets, wanting to be cancelled by the right. Toby Young in Britain cancelled by his own Conservative government before being reinstated in various forms. So this happens on the right hugely, and you could talk about blasphemy, you can talk about heresy, right? Where the right say you can't say this against this religion, that's terrible. Freedom of speech. And wanting to be cancelled. So any blasphemy laws and heresy laws are from the right. There's no liberal countries that are going to uphold such laws, right? So and the list is really quite long. You've got Brian Kemp in America. So again, it's always in America, isn't it? So Brian Kemp, for his gubernatorial campaign. Now, bearing in mind, he had a history, or has a history, of disenfranchising minority black Democratic voters, right? And this is after redlining and gerrymandering. He's been in trouble for suppressing voter rights and suppressing the vote. So if you're talking about cancelling someone's democratic voice is pretty much cancelling their citizenship to a large degree. You don't get more cancelled than that, okay? And he said in his campaign that was called Offends, right? So you can see where the right's coming from at times. He said, I believe in God, family and country in that order. I say Merry Christmas and God bless you. I strongly support President Trump, our troops and ironclad borders. I stand for the national anthem. If any of this offends you, then I'm not your guy. If you're ready for a politically incorrect conservative, yada, 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 I'm Brian Kemp and I'm asking for your vote. Wow. So, up for offending people and also up for cancelling people's democratic rights. So the right really do cancel or attempt to cancel, and they are, in my opinion, at least as bad as the left, and I would argue far worse. But the problem is, it's just not called cancel culture as much as it is on the left. So the right get away with doing this, and Trump can claim on Twitter that X and Y should be cancelled, blah blah blah. This person you shouldn't use this company. This person shouldn't be doing this or whatever. And you don't get right wing media sources like Fox News calling that cancel culture and attacking him for trying to cancel people. No. So it's one rule for the left and another for the right. My next point is hypocrisy. So you have people like Barry Weiss, who was one of the signatories for the Harper's letter. She was in trouble earlier in her career, or while she was at university, for trying to cancel certain people and get professors to lose their jobs for criticising Israel. And then she ends up signing the letter about cancel culture. And you're thinking, hang on, this is a bit rich. You got Natasha Tynes, the author, who got into trouble. So you have Natasha Tynes, the author, who had a book due to be released, and then on Twitter she took a picture of a black metro worker. I say black because it might be relevant, because some people are saying there's racist intentions, who was eating on the metro, and she was wanting this person to be sacked. So she was publicly shaming this person because you're not allowed to eat on the metro, for eating on the metro, saying, look at this person is breaking the rules that the metro has, and she works for the metro, she should be sacked. And then what happened with her is that people thought that was pretty terrible, and then started shaming her on Twitter, and she had her book cancelled for distribution, and then there was a court case, and actually it was distributed in the end. But the point is that she can't complain of cancel culture if the entire premise of her, the entire foundation of the whole issue was her trying to cancel someone else's job. Fully, rank hypocrisy. The Daily Mail with Ben and Jerry's, the Daily Mail complaining about cancel culture and then trying to cancel Ben and Jerry's. And as I said, Trump for that. In fact, so many examples of when it happens on the right are from sources who themselves attempt to call out cancel culture. And it's a whole example of hypocrisy. And I'm not a fan. So that's point 4. Point 5 is that there are many so-called claims of cancel culture that are not in fact cancel culture. And this then feeds into the whole idea that it's overblown. So there are many examples that aren't actually cancel culture. I'll just list just a few of them. And David French brought up this example, and I talked about it on the Unbelievable podcast. And it was one of his headline examples in his article, one of the main examples he uses, which is Calhoun, the PR exec for Boeing, losing his job, resigning because there was a complaint supposedly, or there was a complaint of an article he had written 30 years before saying that women shouldn't be able to serve on the front line in the armed forces. And he, after this one single complaint that was made about this article, which he had rescinded his beliefs of the article, he ended up resigning, and everyone calls this cancel culture. And I was thinking, well, I'm not too sure about this. Let's look at the details here. It turns out he'd only been in the job 6 months. He had been blaming pilots for the crashes of the Boeing 737 MAX. He had a really controversial remuneration sort of pay structure in place that he had elected to keep. He was supposedly an unlikable person doing a job that was particularly difficult with PR in Boeing at the time. And so it turns out that actually there was a lot of good reasons why he would be moving on, or the board might want to move him on. So this is one of these things where someone, and Boeing might have used the excuse of this to move him on, but actually that's not really what happened. He wasn't really cancelled by one, single complaint. Because if you were Boeing, and if this person had worked for a long time and was really valued, you could bet your bottom dollar they wouldn't be giving in to just one single complaint and letting this guy go. So there's definitely more going on there. I would say that is definitely not cancel culture. He threw the previous CEO under the bus. He was not the most popular of people. Robert M. Price, famous atheist author, who has just supposedly been cancelled, and he's done a whole video on this. He wasn't cancelled. So he wrote the foreword for Flashing Swords, a sword and sorcery anthology. And so the publisher brought together a whole bunch of authors who wrote their stories for the anthology. And Robert M. Price was going to write the foreword. He then subsequently writes a foreword, and the foreword includes a bunch of stuff about men, women, and rape and false accusations of rape, and the whole ideology that you see often on the right to do with rape and women and men and highly controversial views. Now, the issue isn't that he's not entitled to those views. You could argue rationally he's not entitled to them, but it's not that he was being cancelled. What happened is the authors found out about this foreword after it was published. They didn't realise with the content of the foreword, and then said, well, actually, we're not happy with this foreword. It doesn't fit with my ideology, and if I knew that foreword was going to be on a book, I wouldn't have contributed my story. So they pulled out, and in the end it had to get sort of pulled from publication because loads of the authors didn't want that. Now, they aren't trying to cancel Robert Price and his opinions, so he's welcome to those opinions somewhere else. They're just saying, look, if I'm writing a book, I don't want that to be the foreword to a fantasy story in my book. I mean, A, it's kind of out of place, to be honest, and B, I ideologically hugely disagree with that. Now, I'm a publisher, and I've edited a bunch of anthologies, and I've got lots of authors to provide forwards to books that other authors have written. I totally get this, right? If I wrote, so I recently edited Not Seeing God, Atheism in the 21st Century, okay? It's so this wonderful book, okay? Now, the foreword by Ed Buckner, imagine he wrote a foreword to that, a book about atheism, and he started going, do you know what, evangelical Christianity is great, and blah, 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 and saying, oh, do you know, I love the way that Christianity gets, privilege in society and all this kind of stuff. Now, imagine that none of the authors knew who's going to write that. The book's then published, and then they read this foreword in a book on atheism that is completely at odds with their views. Then they would rightfully be angry and rightfully want to pull their chapters. And I and me as an editor would be, well, it would be partly my fault for not thinking that would be a problem. So this isn't cancellation. It's not that if Ed Buckner had written that, like I wouldn't cancel Ed Buckner by pulling the book. What you're doing is saying, actually, that doesn't fit in with the theme of the project, and it was a bad choice of content for this project, and the authors aren't happy. Now, as a result, we're going to pull the book in the form it's in. That's pretty much capitalism. That's like the consumers. Well, it's both. The consumers might not be a good forward for the consumers, but it's also not a good forward for the authors. Okay, so it's yeah, you've got issues that's not cancel culture. You've got Alex Morse, who's a Democratic mayor, and this has been brought up by the progressive left, Anna Kasparian and others, talking about Alex Morse, Democratic mayor that went for a congressional primary and had a political hit job done on him. So he was a gay professor, I think, in a university, and the corporate Democrat candidates team produced a campaign that denigrated him on account of supposed sexual predation amongst college students. It turns out that effectively what was happening, it was lies, and really what this was a political hit job that then people on the left said, well, I'm going to take back my endorsement of this guy because of the claims here. I mean, that's ridiculous. We can't endorse him because of that. Well, actually, they rushed to their conclusions because they weren't true, those claims. And if they had just been a bit more sceptical and a bit more thorough in their due process, then actually he wouldn't have lost that primary election, arguably. So that's not him being cancelled on account of X, Y, and Z, which many people claim happened. He lost an election because of outright lies that played on the possibly the oversensitivity of some of the progressive left. So you could argue that cancel culture, progressive sensitivity, maybe there's a link there, but really that was a political hit job. Andrew Neil, a right-wing commentator in the UK, claims that Owen Jones cancelled him or tried to cancel him. But again, you look at the details of that, it's not cancel culture, because again, that's not what Owen Jones said or did. You claiming that of him is actually a lie in itself, and that again, not an example of cancel culture, but that gets wrapped up and in this whole narrative, and it gets reported as cancel culture when it isn't. So again, not a problem, but not a cancel culture issue. But when you start including all of these examples in the list of people who have been cancelled or attempted to be cancelled, then that list looks massive, but actually half of them aren't proper examples of cancel culture, and the issue therefore isn't as big as you are claiming it really is. Point 6, freedom of speech issue. The idea that cancel culture leads to deplatforming people and they don't have the freedom of speech is often risible. Like, so you hear of the Weinsteins, the two, is it Brett and Eric, two brothers who were cancelled, the Evergreen College scandal. Now, you can argue actually that the Evergreen College situation was a pretty poorly handled one. However, what happened here is he didn't lose his freedom of speech. He has more subscribers now than I've got grass seed in my shed. He's got more patrons on Patreon than you can shake a hairy stick at. The guy is testifying in Congress. He is getting speaking engagements around the world. Here is a guy, or one of the brothers, who is doing exceptionally well. Okay, he has not been cancelled. He is in fact been the opposite of cancelled. He's doing exceptionally well and has a huge platform. Louis C.K., the comedian who actually sexually harassed and was supposedly cancelled for that, now doing comedy shows where he's getting standing ovations. Like the cognitive dissonance with people who obviously liked him have some weird psychological way of harmonizing the evidence with their liking of Louis C.K. to the point where now that he's performing to them, they're giving him a standing ovation, as if like sexual harassment has added to his attraction as a performer. Totally bizarre, and you know, Dave Chappelle as well. Actually, the comedy industry and the entertainment industry is capitalism. You know, people. If producers and companies don't appreciate what these people are saying and doing, they're thinking about their consumers. If they can make money out of it, they'll make money out of it. If they think, well, these guys are controversial, actually we're not going to run them. That's capitalism. Do you know what? That's I'm sorry. You know, you take your issue up with people making these decisions based on end consumption. J.K. Rowling, you just can't deplatform her. You know, even David French was admitted this last night. You're never going to deplatform her. You can't cancel J.K. Rowling. And in fact, her message has been used in court now to challenge trans rights. And so actually, her message is not only incredibly, I think, dangerous for the trans community, but she has a massive platform with which to perpetuate that message, and I think that's pretty controversial. But she has no problem being able to say these things. Trump grabbed women's genitalia, groped them, and rather than being cancelled, he was elected into the most powerful job in the world. Wow! I mean, he should have been cancelled, but wasn't. Mel Gibson and Gary Oldman defending, you know, and saying things about Jews in Hollywood, and still getting nominated for Oscars. It's just Roman Polanski. I don't know. There seems to not be an issue with people being able to say what they want to say, because at the end of the day, if you get hounded off Twitter, you just go to Parler or Gab or these other places. There are no one is really shutting down your freedom of speech. That happens very rarely, it seems. The occasional person might lose their job, which, when it is not warranted, that is a problem. And if that is a result of Twitter mob mentality, then yes, that is a problem, and it does happen. I'm not saying it never happens. It does happen. What I'm saying is there's an awful lot of times where it doesn't happen, and where people are still able to say what they want to say, and say it with an even louder voice and bigger platform. So there you go on that one. People in immense power using their platforms, never actually getting cancelled and continuing to say what they say. Point 7. Those criticising are accessing their own freedom of speech, the right to freedom of speech. So you can't have a go at people. Well, you can have a go at people hounding people on Twitter, just as not being very nice, but they have their right to say that if you really do believe in freedom of speech. And this is the problem with freedom of speech, is that actually it's a bit of a broken concept. So you get people saying, oh, you should be entitled to say what you like. And you say, well, where do you draw the line? Because there has to be a line somewhere. You can't say, right, you're a teacher in class, and a pupil stands up in front of you and shouts swear words at you for an entire lesson and racially abuses you for that entire lesson, so that no one else can learn and nothing else can happen. They've got freedom of speech. Surely they can just say that. Well, no, because actually they're infringing other people's rights, and that's not acceptable, and no one would find that acceptable. So of course we would draw a line there. Well, where do you draw that line of what is hate speech or what is acceptable to say and what isn't? Walking down the road just shouting racial abuse at people, is that acceptable? So it's a subjective, arbitrary line as to what people should be able to say and what they shouldn't, and that's your problem, is that it's subjective. So how do you arbitrate for something that for one person is offensive and for another person isn't, or for the person saying it, they don't think it's offensive, but the person hearing it is actually offended by it. And we the whole nature of freedom of speech is pretty tricky waters. And my final point is chronocentrism, the idea that actually, this has been happening forever and a day. Heresy, blasphemy, having a go at imagine 200 years ago you stood up and had it, or 500 years ago stood up and had a right go at the Christian church. you'd be executed. You think about 60 years ago and racial equality and standing up and saying things. Times change, but we are no less or more moralistic now. I think what's happened is Twitter and social mass media, or mass social media, have come along, and every human being in Western culture, at least, or most people, have a public voice. Just Joe Public, every single person can shout their views out to the world, and they can be heard, and they can trend on Twitter. 50 years ago, it used to be the elite, powerful, rich, and the people that were in media. Now it's everyone. And with that, everyone's opinions are out there, and everyone's opinions are public. And so this can present quite a problem. And B, the idea that we have the same amount of fundamentalist moralising, or authoritarian moralising, or very staunch moralising. You have the same amount of that, but it's now being applied to a more granular subject matter. So those really big issues, and by big I don't mean more important to the individual. What I mean is more prevalent because there are more people who fall under that umbrella. So the real big issues of gender equality and racial equality affected so many millions of people, say in America, over the last century. Half the population are women. A good deal of the population are black Americans. So those moral issues were really big and evident, and that's what people spent a lot of time moralising about. And because those issues are now largely solved, philosophically solved, not in society. There's still obviously issues with equality in both of those subjects. But now lots of people see those issues as being solved. They then move to smaller issues like trans rights. Now, again, I'm not saying it's a smaller issue for that trans person. That might affect them just as much as racial equality and gender equality to other people. What I'm saying is there are fewer people, so it's a smaller issue in that respect. These more granular issues then have the same amount of moralising going on with them, and the problem might then erupt from that actually people don't really understand trans issues in the wider community, and so there's just uncertainty and a lack of knowledge, which then leads to arguments that are just very bad arguments, or people arguing past each other, and it all becomes really, really messy. And you might get people having cognitive dissonance and favouring J.K. Rowling because she wrote these great books that they love, and so therefore what she says on trans is going to convince them even more, and so they'll side with her even though they don't really understand the issues or whatever. So it's not only that social media is much more prevalent in this day and age, but it's that each of these issues is becoming more granular and has the same amount of moral fundamentalism and absolutism with many people. And you put those things together and you get people, wanting to be cancelled over something to do with a trans issue, which 60 years ago, 50 years ago during the civil rights, or now actually more so, you might apply a different kind of metric to say, that's unfair that they should be cancelled for saying something about trans people, but actually I would accept them being cancelled for saying something about racial inequality over there. So, and I think that's an interesting scenario. And so people call out the cancel culture as being applied to maybe a trans issue, but might see it as much more acceptable being applied to a racial inequality issue, so or racism issue. So it's a very difficult scenario, made no less difficult by the fact that we have social media that allows us to cast our opinions wide and loudly. And there you go. So those are my main 8 issues that make it a very difficult landscape to paint an accurate picture of. And I think a lot of people get it wrong, and the left are the whipping boy for the right, and it's easy pickings, and the right are butchering the centre ground by the right saying, look at the left, they're terrible, cancel culture left, and you can't say what you want, and all the while they're attracting the centre ground over to the dark side, by demonising the left as being authoritarian cancel culture nut jobs. But the reality is that the right do it just as much, as I hope I've shown at least a little example of. So the last thing to say on this would be, well, how do you solve this issue? And I don't know. I've said all this and I've whinged a lot, but I don't know how you solve the cancel culture issue other than due process of people being removed from their jobs, where you don't fire from the hip and you take on board all the available evidence and make a very measured conclusion as to what has happened, and far too often people are just rushing to very hasty moral conclusions, and I think that's dangerous. You could say you could cancel Twitter. That might help. Well, yeah, but somewhere else will come along. We need to learn to cope with social media, I think, a little bit better, and I wonder whether time will actually heal things. So we'll better learn how to deal with Twitter. We'll better learn or understand trans issues, for example, as time goes on, as we gain more knowledge. So I wonder whether in 5 years' time this will be less of an issue. I'm absolutely positive it will. The other issue that underwrites cancel culture, particularly in America, is the fact that it's really representative of a polarization in politics. And that's not helped by a strictly two-party system where your third-party candidates are never, ever going to get voted in, ever. And in a two-party system, you just get a negative polarization where people move to the ends and they're shouting at each other from the far side of the political spectrum. And there's no kind of safe space, so to speak, in the centre. In Britain, that's changing. We're a far more pluralistic political landscape at the moment, where we used to just be Labour and Conservative. Now there are 5 or 6 parties that are in the mix. America, the United States just isn't there, and I guess you'd have to reform the whole electoral system. So the electoral college would need reforming, so that it's far more proportionally representative, the voting over there, in order that voices are better represented by candidates that will hopefully then stop everything moving apart, so that you get parties that represent everyone along and candidates that represent everyone along that continuum, so everyone gets a fairer representation and you're not so polarised, and you will have your centrists being able to have a voice and a democratic power. Perhaps that will be one of those solutions to this radical left and radical right monopolising the political discourse. Anyway, I hope that sums up my views on this, because I feel quite strongly about that. I really do. I could do a whole video really on the culture wars narrative, and the fact that this is a case of the right really attracting the centre and even people on the left over to their way of thinking, and getting people to vote for them because you should be scared of the cancel culture that the left are perpetuating. You should be able to say Merry Christmas, and you should be able to you shouldn't be able to kill a baby with abortion, and you should be able to run around with guns, and all this kind of stuff that gets people really emotively engaged. It's the hearts and minds campaigning that Republicans are so good at, that the Democrats are sadly so bad at. And I think this is just a part of that larger jigsaw, this cancel culture issue. It can be an issue, but it's not the big issue that people think it is. Anyway, if you disagree, tell me down there. Drop by my blog at A Tippling Philosopher on the Patheos Non-Religious Network. And as ever, question everything, and buy all my books. Oh yeah, and subscribe, or even get some merch that's listed below. All that kind of stuff. Please subscribe and like, and you know what all other YouTubers say. All that stuff. It's all really important, I think. Anyway, take it easy.